Kingery-Page to speaking to us today. She's a licensed landscape architect and associate dean in the College of Architecture, Planning and Design at K-State. Her training spans sculpture, art theory, ecology, and landscape architecture. What I've heard about her presentation is that there will be focus on gardens of drought-adapted native plants that will provide ecological, therapeutic, and learning benefits. Her talk will focus on lessons learned designing, building, and maintaining such gardens and using them as settings for research on the benefits of time and nature. Her work co-creating landscapes with community members centers on the many ways public space can be restorative to diverse audiences of people. And here's Katie Kingery-Page.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chris, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really happy to be here with the Douglas County Master Gardeners today. I see many people I know in your list of names and faces, and that is wonderful today. Chris, can you remind me how long we have total, including our question time?
Sorry, we were planning for an hour, but if you need a little more, you know, people are usually plenty willing, so.
I will try to keep us on track time-wise. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin a slideshow. And to maybe help with bandwidth, I will go back to my no video. You'll just see my still face, but I'll come back on live when we do questions. So let's see if I can get my share going. Okay, can everyone see a slideshow? Oops, it's going forward. Hold on, what's happening here? Can everyone see the slides? Have I shared the right screen?
Yes, you have.
Excellent, okay. As Chris said, my name is Katie Kingery-Page. I'm a licensed landscape architect. I've been a faculty member in landscape architecture for about 15 years in the College of Architecture, Planning and Design at K-State. And just in the past year, I guess this month would mark the second year of my role as Associate Dean for our college. And before we get too much further into the content of the talk, I want to let you know that I've framed this really broadly. Restorative, having the power to restore, something that serves to restore consciousness, vigor, or health. And I'm really going to talk about this in terms of landscapes in 3 different dimensions. Social restoration, or what we might actually call, in a bit more precision, the development of social capital. Psychological restoration, using one of the dominant theories of psychological restoration, attention restoration theory. And at the end, the last segment of the talk will be about ecological restoration. I think we'll break kind of at the 2/3 point before the ecological part and take a few questions and then go on. So I want to tell you just a little bit about my background, because I do think that my approach to thinking about the restorative power of landscape is a little bit unorthodox. And that could have to do with the way in which I've come into landscape architecture and practiced in landscape architecture. Most recently, I've designed and led community-built landscapes like this one. This is the meadow near the Beach Museum of Art at the K-State campus. And it's used for a whole variety of purposes, which I'll talk about a little more in the talk, but they include using this as a programming place to connect the regional art collection of the museum to the regional landscape. My background is in fine art. My first degree was in sculpture. And even as an art student, I was always a little bit obsessed with the power of place and what its meaning was for me and for other people. I grew up in Wichita and then all over the Midwest in a family of what we like to call itinerant intellectuals. And so I came back to Wichita for college, kind of hoping to find a home place. And this was the old neighborhood I grew up in, the Old North End. If any of you are Wichitans, you might remember the Derby oil refinery, which has now been torn down. But it was such a fixture of my childhood that as a young student, I found myself having to figure out myself in context of this landscape, certainly not a restorative landscape. And my sculpture was often using natural materials and again, thinking about place. This is the Northern Californian coast where I spent many summers as a teenager working in organic farming and garden projects. Being a city kid in Kansas, I know that sounds counterintuitive, but I had not grown up in our agrarian context. And so I went all the way to Northern California to learn about what agrarianism was. As a sculpture student, you can see that I was a little bit obsessed with natural forms and things, and these are also all materials that come from junkyards, so things that were found in particular places. This is a sculpture made of crow feathers that I would find on walks in Wichita through the cemetery. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of the fact that I'm coming to landscape architecture interested in personal experience of place and interested in the many different ways that place affects us. I came to graduate school in the Flint Hills of Kansas at K-State. That would have been about 1998. And I know here on this talk today on this Zoom, we have some other graduates of this very same program, including my good friend Judy Birch, who's here today. This is a landscape that has an incredible ecological function. You could say it has a psychologically restorative function too for those who use it. And it really became the setting for my study and understanding of what larger landscape could be. One of my very first built landscapes was a demonstration project of native plants in Johnson County. Some of you may have been to this building. It's a county agency building related to the JO, their transit system. And it was built for stormwater purposes. So as I said, now I'm serving the larger College of Architecture, Planning and Design at K-State. And as such, I hope you'll humor me my 1-second pitch for our college. If any of you know people who would like to become landscape architects, interior architects, regional and community planners, or industrial designers, we offer degrees both for first-time degree seeking students, those entering as undergrads, and also for graduate students. So who needs restoration? I hope everybody's hand is up in the room as I say that question. Personally, for me, many recent life events have shown me how much I need restoration. I suffer with a chronic illness, which is early onset osteoarthritis. So last year at age 44, I actually had my first joint replacement done, which is a little young. You know, maybe some of you as gardeners have also had these kinds of rejuvenated joints, shall we say. But generally people aren't doing this so young in their life. And it really has created for me an understanding of how much I need the natural world as part of my own health and restoration and pain management. I also am a mother. You can see a couple of my kids here in that center photo. And this is a part of my need for psychological restoration. There's so many stresses in the world. I would say that parenting, and even in all of its greatest joys, can also be one of the most stressful endeavors. So that's my personal story of why I need restoration. There's other reasons. I'm sure each of you has your own reason to need restoration today. I'm going to introduce a series of concepts related to the restorative power of landscape. And I want to kind of make a caveat and say that any of these concepts could probably be its own talk, actually could be its own symposium or week-long conference. That's how rich all of these concepts are. So I want to acknowledge in advance that I'll be introducing these in a very cursory way. And I hope if they arouse your curiosity or you want to learn more, that you'll pursue some of the sources and do that investigation. I'm definitely happy to share slides and references after this talk with anyone who would like them. So if we think about the sort of foundational theory of humans and their relationship to landscape and restoration, biophilia hypothesis would be at that foundation. And the hypothesis is essentially that because of our evolutionary history as humans, we have a need and an attraction to nature. There's many different evidences for this hypothesis having some bearing on reality, and here is just one. This is some famous seminal work about how people responded to their cancer treatment in relation to the kind of environment they were in. And what these studies found was that even views to nature, not even being in nature, even views, and Ulrich actually did take this concept even further, even imagery, not real nature views, resulted in less pain and less need for pain medication for people. So effectively was reducing their stress level. Here's just an illustrative example. You can imagine this as a view out of a hospital window. I think I've stayed in some hospital rooms that had views much like this. Or you could imagine this as a view out of a restorative setting. Not that we see that very much, right? But the difference, I think, is it's kind of palpable to us just as we consider these images ourselves as humans. So I'm going to start talking about social restoration or social capital. And you won't see too much. You'll see a little bit of native plants in this portion, but then we'll get toward those landscapes. But I want to begin by saying, sometimes in our work as makers of landscape, and I'm including all of you in that group, because I know that probably one thing which motivates you to be master gardeners is that you like to be engaged on a daily basis with plants and with landscapes. And for all of us engaged in making landscapes for people, there can be a tendency for us to be kind of almost Pollyanna-ish about the way we think it benefits others. And I want to encourage all of us to be just as critical about that aspect of what we're doing with landscapes as we are about any other aspect. So what is social capital? It's the collection of links, relationships, also norms, values, and resources that allow a society to function. And as we're thinking about gardens and landscapes that we design and build and maintain and are part of, it's important to consider what that garden might be socially and be realistic also about what it's not. Be intentional in researching and setting goals for our projects. And just a little hint at some of the literature that is out there about this topic. This particular study interviewed 52 individuals who are part of 10 different racially diverse community gardens in the US and had some surprising results, because they did find that, as many people hypothesized, that community gardens generate a sense of community, a sense of belonging. One of the other very common hypotheses about community gardens is that it grows social capital in terms of people having greater access to resources through those connections. And this particular study did not find that to be true, but they did find that high sense of belonging, which is valuable in and of itself. So there's a rich body of literature out here, and I would encourage you to dig into it if you're someone who is interested in the social aspect of gardening. An example of that type of project that I want to share with you quickly is a learning garden that I designed with colleagues here at K-State and the community at the school. This is a public school setting called Northview School in our local school district. The teachers were a huge part of shaping this garden. Students were a big part of it too, and it was all community built by the neighborhood and the school. So I'll get into some images of this. This is what our site looked like. Some of the kids helping us. Kids have fun. You'll never see a kid having more fun than when they have a pile of gravel or sand to play with. Many work days, in fact, 18 long weekends to build this garden. Here's a particularly tired day for us. This was the same day that pile arrived, and we were distributing it and also using a vibrating compactor to compact it. But eventually the garden began to really take shape and began to be used by the school. However, for me, it was a really great lesson in all those assumptions we make about social capital and the act of creating something together. Because this is a little bit of a sad story. Less than a year after the community had invested all that time, 250 people, 18 weekends building this garden, the district and the school decided to add an addition to this school building that effectively wiped out the garden. Luckily, we had a strong principal, and she was able to negotiate with the district to consider relocating the garden as a part of the cost of that expansion. So the garden was rebuilt, but really never with kind of the same level of community investment and sense of belonging to it. So for me, there was a huge investigation in what goes wrong, what goes right, what's successful with schoolyard gardens, what creates success. And I really dove into that literature and found that it's a strong champion. Excellent, strong principles at public schools are what create strong schoolyard gardens. And I started to become interested in small parks and other kinds of landscapes that were used by people in maybe a more casual way, right? So the last example I showed you, that was the schoolyard garden was for curriculum. It was very much tied to the school's curriculum. It was very structured. And this is an example of a landscape my students and I have been a part of that's very casual. This is what's called the Wichita Pop-Up Park, ICT Pop-Up Park in Wichita. And it was literally a vacant lot. If any of you watch Parks and Rec, it was a 15-foot hole. So it was like the pit or the hole. That's kind of a joke in that show. And it was just collecting stagnant rainwater. Luckily, there were some city agencies and other stakeholders. This is private property, the property owner, who wanted to see it become something else. So the reason I'm including this, even though you'll see these are not native plants, right? We're not necessarily looking at ecological restoration through this project. There was a high degree of social capital built through this. And you can see how people adopted the place. What you see here is a design that our students really pushed forward, advocating. They advocated on behalf of what they learned from community members to create a place with vegetation, because all of the initial schema were really just gravel lots with food trucks due to maintenance concerns. I'm sure this is a constant value on your mind as master gardeners, maintenance concerns. So we were successful in advocating for some green in this place, and it became incredibly popular. Also in the background, you see some custom art that one of our students, Nick Mercado, designed and fabricated for the place, and a whole lot of different activities. Some of them temporary, some of them more permanent, like the concrete ping pong tables have activated this space over time. Here you can see the food trucks and people gathering. So I'm going to step back now from that social capital or social restoration idea in landscape, and let's move toward the more individual. Can you all hear me okay? I know you're muted. Chris, give me a thumbs up. I got a thumbs up from Chris. Thank you. Okay, excellent. I can be a low talker, as if you know me, you might know that. I can start to kind of go into the whisper zone. So if I'm being too quiet, I hope someone will speak up. But coming toward that more individual, which of course affects the collective. If we are psychologically restored or have access to nature for psychological restoration, it affects all of our collective needs as a people. But let's talk about this a bit and get into some of this theory. Now, I'm calling out my friend Judy Birch again here because these theories were actually at the heart of her master's thesis in our MLA program. So I've already warned Judy that this will be just the briefest skim. But again, these ideas, if they interest you, certainly take a deeper dive into this literature. I think it's really fascinating. So psychological restoration, defined as those restorative experiences that involve the renewal of psychological resources. And we're talking about our own personal resources that are depleted by stress. Those same reasons I showed you with my dang old knees and my stressful children, all the things that can deplete us in life, right? We have so many things, even just having to focus our attention on a computer screen for many hours a day can be incredibly psychologically depleting. Okay. So within that area of psychological restoration, attention restoration theory, which was developed by a team of researchers led by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, is one of the foundational theories that people use. And I'm going to just describe some of the aspects of that. I'll use pictures of this recent project that I've been the lead on, the Meadow at the Beach Museum, which I showed you earlier in the talk. And this project was begun in 2011. We broke ground, well, that's the wrong term really, but we began installation in 2013. We didn't break ground quite purposefully because we didn't want to turn up all the weed seeds in the soil. But we started this installation of native plants in 2013, and you can see a little bit about the project here. So psychological restoration is seen taking place in situations that involve psychological distance from aspects of one's usual routines and demands on directed attention. And what the Kaplans called this quality of something which is restorative, they called that quality being away. So the meadow is a good example because even in the heart of the campus, it's quite different. And if you step into the midst of this landscape, especially in high summer when it's 4 feet tall, you really do feel like you're away. You're in a different kind of setting than whatever you were doing in your office or in the rest of the campus. So being away, and it's also being away involves disrupting all of those demands on our directed attention, which the psychological concept behind this is directed and undirected attention, or soft attention. Directed attention is these are the tasks, the need for attention generated by tasks that we must focus on, or things that we must focus on. Whereas soft attention or undirected attention, these are things we do without even thinking about them. They probably relate to our evolutionary biology. If you think about when you hear a bird chirping in the trees and it gains your attention, but it's not doing so in a directed, task-oriented way, right? It's a soft, undirected kind of attention. So the Kaplans said it's that undirected, soft attention, that being away, which is restorative to people. So let's look at some visual examples of being away. Here is one of our young volunteers in the meadow. He's doing some weeding, a young Boy Scout. And here he is in an environment that's probably quite different than that he experiences in his day-to-day school life, right? He's having a sense of being away. Or, he might also be thinking, geez, there's a lot of weeds here. I don't know what he was thinking, but he definitely was in a setting to be away. More images of the meadow. A second quality that a restorative, psychologically restorative environment needs to have under attention restoration theory is fascination. So psychological restoration includes that effortless attention engaged by objects in the environment, or the process of making sense of the environment, which the one psychological term for that is fascination. We also talked about soft attention. So fascination means the environment is sufficiently complex to engage us. There is something that my undirected attention can be part of. So let's look at some fascination. Here's an example of leaves on trees. I know I'm talking to a bunch of nature lovers in this particular room, which is why I love talking to master gardeners, your plants people, and I'm certain that this makes sense to you. The way that leaves are moving on a tree in the breeze, that is something which draws our fascination. Maybe it's just the textures of a path and the textures of foliage and seed heads. This is again at the meadow. That could be something that is creating a sense of fascination or allowing your soft, undirected attention toward it. A third quality of a restorative environment is the ability for us to immerse ourselves in a coherent environment that is sufficient of scope to sustain exploration. And that scope is really the key concept here. And the Kaplans called that quality extent. So does the landscape have sufficient extent? So as we think about extent and what it means, can I visualize that the landscape is bigger than me or just my immediate surrounding? Does it feel like it's part of a larger whole? This is one of the benches in the meadow. Actually, we're about to replace this bench because it's made of hackberry and it's kind of lived out its 5-year natural lifetime. But a few years ago, it still looked pretty good. And you can imagine being on that bench and the sense of extent that you might have looking out over this landscape. Another view looking toward the museum and the sense of this site and its landscape being large enough to give you that sense of extent. And this is sometimes why in urban environments, we struggle to create places that really feel restorative because we can be constrained in our scope. There are still ways to do it within design. We won't talk a lot about that today, but even in a small space, we can kind of fool our minds to imagine extent, right? And it might be due to a framed view or a borrowed landscape kind of idea. Okay, a fourth quality that a restorative, psychologically restorative landscape must have is what the Kaplans call compatibility. Congruence between my personal inclinations and purposes and needs, the environmental supports for my intended activities, and the environmental demands for the action that may occur. So compatibility, and boy, does that make it sound complicated. But if we break it down, what is compatibility? It's actually quite simple. Will this landscape work for me? Is there a firm enough surface under my feet that I can be mobile in this landscape? And you can imagine that varies by audiences, doesn't it? And now that I've dealt with my knee issues, wow, am I sensitive to ground plane and changes in ground plane and understanding just how important different kinds of walking surfaces are for people. It could also be a place to sit, like these benches provide. Obviously, these benches are not ideal for some populations. Older adults might need something with more back support and arm support, easier to push up and stand up from. But nonetheless, they're providing a place to rest. Another thing I've become very sensitive to with my knee issues and walking is needing those periodic places to rest your body. And another aspect of compatibility that's a bit subtle in this picture, but I think you can pick up on, if you see the large tree at the left, it's a swamp cypress tree. This centerpiece, sort of center space of the meadow, is the most shady place, and it is where people love to be in our climate. So I always think of shade as a key aspect of compatibility for Midwestern settings where we have such harsh sun and harsh summers. Let's talk just a little bit about some of the evidence for attention restoration theory, and I'm going to move us toward learning and why this is so important for learning. So studies done by the Kaplans and their colleagues, they used a biometric measure in several studies, cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone. There's many different ways to measure this, but one of them is a saliva swab, wherein the saliva is then evaluated for the stress hormone cortisol. And so what they found was exposure to green natural settings reduced cortisol levels in people. Kind of fascinatingly, the research in this area has gone toward dosage of nature. So how much nature is needed for this kind of stress reduction response? And very interesting to me is that in several studies which used they used images, actually not immersion, but images of street trees on kind of leafy shaded streets. And what they found was that 30% of the field of vision was optimal for stress reduction. So if 30% of the field of vision for the person in the study, if that was green, in this case it was tree canopy, that was optimal for creating a reduction in stress as measured by cortisol levels. That gives us some things to think about, doesn't it? It really does, as people who design and care for, maintain, and care about landscapes. When someone looks at your landscape at their eye level, and this depends on if they're 3, 30, what age are they, how tall are they, what are they seeing? Are they getting a sufficient dose of greenness to help them? There's some other very interesting research that has come out of the University of Illinois. That's the second quote, or sorry, not quote, but summary here on the slide. Long-term studies of children raised in housing, and this took place in Chicago public housing. They had what we call kind of a natural research setup in this public housing, in that some units looked out toward asphalt pavement and some looked out toward views of trees. So they had sort of a natural situation to study, and they found that children raised in the housing with views to trees, they were more likely to pursue college, and they were less likely to be engaged in violence than their peers, which is obviously a correlation, not a causation, but a pretty interesting correlation with views to nature. So let's take this toward learning. And I think of us all as lifelong learners. I'm not only saying this is about children, but I definitely think this ought to give us pause for how we design those spaces that our children are learning in for 7 to 9 hours a day. We're in this crazy time of pandemic where there's been a call for more green and natural schoolyards. And I'm sure that that's an issue that some of you are involved with and may find a calling to be involved with. So what is learning? And we'll get toward why would landscape play into that? The best definition I found of learning, which I really love, it's so simple. Learning is the process of committing something to long-term memory. That's it, right? And if you think about it, yeah, that captures learning. Either I committed it to memory or I didn't. However, to get there, to commit something to long-term memory is a complex process, and it does require attention and focus. So let's look at some of our schoolyard environments for children. This schoolyard is in Oakland, California, but honestly, it's not that much different than schoolyards I experienced as a kid in Wichita, Kansas, Springfield, Illinois. I'll never forget my middle school asphalt schoolyard where the school's incinerator released ash over us as we played outside at lunchtime. It was like something out of The Simpsons, honestly, if you know that show. So it felt that way. These are the environments that we're making for our young people, and we're expecting them to be able to learn and have a high degree of directed attention and high functioning cognitive processes in spite of the types of environments that we're giving to them. And I'm just going to flash up that image from my Biophilia slide. By the way, this is a picture I took in Muir Woods of Northern California, if you've ever been there, which had to be one of the most restorative green environments I've ever stepped into. And don't you just feel that like automatic kind of relief looking at this picture as compared to this picture and those poor little children out there? Wow. Yeah, quite a different feeling. So that process, which we can oversimplify here as conscious processing with the working memory, and then moving something toward long-term memory, storage for later retrieval, this is basically what occurs in learning. And it takes a high degree of directed attention. So let's think about stress and the impact on learning. Negative emotions, what's known as they narrow the scope of attention and thinking. Negative emotions result in the release of stress hormone that can reduce the effectiveness of frontal lobes, a brain for learning. And some studies have revealed that it can take more than an hour for a student who has felt stress or distress to return to being able to learn. Well, this changed the way I taught as a college professor, because I recognized that our models, which often have to do with putting students under stress, are counterproductive to the whole enterprise we're interested in. Think about a student who's just gotten the results of a math test or in higher education, whatever it might be, their physics exam, and what they're feeling in terms of stress after the professor hands that out at the start of the hour. And then they're expected to immediately engage in learning, whereas their brain's not going to be ready for at least an hour, maybe 2 hours to get back to learning. So since we know that stress is negative in terms of our ability to learn, for several years, I've worked with my graduate students to design imaginative schoolyards. I showed you the one that we built. These are unbuilt designs for various schools. This one was a sensory playground intended for a school that has kind of a magnet population for children on the autism spectrum. And then this is that rebuilt, the Northview schoolyard I told you about that was relocated and rebuilt eventually. This is its second life, its second incarnation. And these are some examples, not by me, but by a wonderful landscape architect, Christine Ten Eck, her practice. These are higher education campus settings. And you can imagine how restorative it could be to leave that physics class and the stress of whatever you were doing and be able to come out here before you get on to your next learning experience. This is why gardens matter. They matter so much to people. Okay, I said we would stop right here to briefly take some questions, and then we can take more at the end. Are there any questions yet?
There's some comments in the box, but no questions as of yet. So just the comments on the Master Gardener Medicinal Garden Group toured the meadow you spoke about at the beginning of your talk when we were planning our little boutique prairie that we have that's near the airport here in Lawrence. And I have one comment here from someone who says, I'm a homeowner living in Midtown Kansas City, Missouri, on a double lot with many challenges. Love gardening. My mom gave me a tiny plot at our house when I was 7 years old. Just an example of how much a garden can mean to people.
Wonderful. I remember that day when the Douglas County gardeners visited the meadow. That was fantastic. And I got to hear a little bit about the project that you all have been working on. I believe your project is in coordination with some folks at KU. Is that right?
Yes, it's actually it's managed by the Kansas Biological Survey, medicinal native plant garden. And the master gardeners manage the sort of demonstration part of that garden. And I do have a question that's just popped up.
Okay, super.
Let's see, does it matter in terms of the plant material? For example, whoops, I lost it here. Hold on. Do trees make more of a difference?
Okay, that is such a great question. I'm going to turn up my video on. Can you see me okay? Hi.
Yes.
That's such a great question, and I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. So when I told you that research in attention restoration theory has really gone toward dosage, the type of material, dosage of nature, they actually call it that. The type of material is one thing that is a variable being studied, but it's not at all conclusive. So right now, I think it's there's conclusive studies that the amount of green matters, but I don't think there's any conclusive study on what kind of vegetation that is. And a question mark in my mind is, we say green, right? Because some plant material is green, but not all plant material is green. And what about desertous landscapes that are, oops, am I drawing on this? I don't know if I'm doing that.
Yes, I believe you are.
That's hilarious. Okay, I'll try not to touch anything. Well, anyway, you can imagine, and maybe some of you have experienced some high desert landscapes that maybe they're green, maybe there's a dusty, silvery green in that definition, but they still might be restorative. I've certainly experienced those sensations in desert landscape and in the fall colors of the Flint Hills, which my brother has affectionately called a Zen landscape, and this season it's brown on tan. But really they're much more complex colors if you've been there, but beautiful rusts and browns. I find being in those landscapes restorative as well. So I think there's still some pretty big question marks about what do we mean when we say green, and what do we mean in terms of the kind or quality of plant material. But we're getting toward how much, and there are also studies that are interested in the time in terms of dosage, right? How long do you need to be out in a natural setting before it has impact? And so far those studies are indicating at least 20 minutes, maybe more, but it's not necessarily enough for us to just step outside of a door quickly to get the full stress reduction benefits. Another interesting study out of that environment behavior lab at U of I, which is Dr. Sullivan's lab, interesting study with one of his graduate students. They looked at people who took breaks in nature in a beautiful campus, green landscape, green turf, shrubs, overhead canopies, should be a restorative environment. What they looked at was if the person was using their handheld device or a laptop while they were out there, was there a difference in stress reduction? And quite sadly for all of us, what they found is yes, that green natural environment is not effective in reducing stress if we're looking at our phones. I personally took that pretty hard because I know my instinct when I go outside to relax is to check my email while I'm relaxing. I should know better, right? It's like, that's not going to be relaxing, but the studies had proved this. So great question. There's still a lot to learn about dose and what is most effective. I'm going to go ahead and...
That was really interesting. There's a couple more questions to get in here. One, do you think the recent houseplant fad is a direct result of pandemic stress?
Great question. I think it preceded pandemic stress, but now it is sure ballooning even more. I like and enjoy houseplants, so I've been a big Instagram follower for many years now of some of these houseplant feeds, etc. It seems like it's been a thing for about a decade. And my feeling is this is a reaction to our digitized world. This is people who are, people's natural reaction, biophiliac reaction to finding a way to bring nature into their lives. When we spend more and more time indoors, more and more time on screens. And of course, the pandemic has only exacerbated that for us, right? I call it Zoom chair syndrome for myself when I will have a day of just 8 hours of Zooming. This is delightful to be with you today. I'm actually going to go outside afterwards, no problem. But when it's 8 hours of sitting in a chair looking at a screen, I don't think I've ever felt quite so tired physiologically, psychologically, all of it. So yes, I agree. The houseplant fad or obsession that people seem to have right now, great time to start a business around houseplants. If that interests you, master gardeners, I've thought about it. I thought maybe I should just give up this associate dean stuff and open a business where people can sip cocktails and pot plants on a big patio. Don't you think that would go over big? I give that idea freely to you.
Yes, I do. And I hope there's a certain master gardener that's listening to that about the cocktails and plants.
Oh, great.
So the questions are now coming in. So you let me know. I'm going to keep going through the questions, but you let me know when you want to start again, and we can save the others for the end.
Okay, super.
So the next one is, your talk is so full of thought-provoking and creativity-inspiring points. I have a question as a person who also gardens in the Midwest in a prairie context. Working in the biophilia hypothesis, how do you design a landscape that makes the most of psychological and ecological forestation in a setting where green isn't always sustainable?
Okay, great. So that wonderful question, and it relates back to that thought about our earlier question as to, are trees really the most effective thing? And we don't know. We really don't know about that. But I would argue that there's so many aspects of that attention restoration theory that don't depend upon green that we can probably hypothesize that we're creating restorative settings, even when we do use native plants that we know are going to have long stretches of the year in rust tones, in black, in silver. And, I find those winter landscapes of native plants to be absolutely stunning. And in terms of capturing my soft attention, they sure do. It's one of my favorite times to be out in the meadow, for example, is when that frost is gathering on blades of grass, and the echinacea seed heads are that gorgeous silhouette-like quality. So I think there's no reason to limit ourselves or to think that we have to use an irrigated palette of plants. I don't think so, but I cannot give you hard data on that yet. I know it's something that Dr. Sullivan's lab at U of I has been interested in. When I've conversed with him at conferences, he said, of course we're interested in that, right? We want to know what qualities of vegetation and landscape. So hopefully they'll have some more evidence for us soon, but maybe that's a good segue into ecological restoration, and we could hold the rest of the comments or questions for after. Does that sound okay?
Yes, and there are quite a few now popping up in the box.
Okay,
so
we will come back to them. I think this is a good segue to ecological restoration, because we sometimes have competing objectives in a landscape. So let's say we are keen on high amounts, a setting with high potential for stress reduction and psychological restoration. But we also recognize that ecological restoration is part of our goals. Well, what does that do? It seeks the highest and best effort progression toward full recovery of ecosystem functioning. And in landscape architecture, we are often using a shorthand of ecosystem services to talk about the things that ecosystems provide in terms of functioning. So let's see if I can get off of this slide I've drawn on. Oh no, it's gonna, guys, I'm so sorry. Let me get rid of that. That's gonna drive me crazy. I don't know how I did it, but hopefully I can undo it. Okay, great. Now if I can just get rid of this. All right, can you see the slide still, everyone? Give me the, yes, thank you, Chris, I got the thumbs up. Okay, So as we think about ecosystem services and functioning, one thing that our native plants do so well, and a huge reason that we might choose them, is the water cycle, is the hydrological benefits. So what we know, I mean, it's been proven now with several studies, is that it does take time, but native plants will increase soil porosity, even in very compacted, disturbed soils, the kinds that most of us are dealing with in urban and suburban settings. These are soils that have been turned over, compacted, built on, very disturbed soil profiles that don't have that kind of sponge-like quality that a native prairie does. But over time, native plants can begin to increase soil porosity. So probably this is a little basic, and forgive me if it's too basic for you, but the soil structure of a native grassland is so complex because of the varied profiles of roots, root systems, and many other qualities of the soil, that it really does act like a sponge for stormwater. So when you're designing and planting and working with native plants, what's above ground matters because it's drought tolerant, it's hardy. You're not going to need to waste potable water to irrigate that landscape beyond probably its first season of installation, maybe in an extreme drought or something, but the native plant landscapes I have built were not watered or irrigated beyond their first year of installation. So you're already benefiting our real water crisis that we have by not using energy intensive potable water. That's the above ground benefit, one of them. Also evapotranspiration, because all of these plant bodies are holding water that falls as rainwater and allowing it to rejoin the hydrological cycle through evapotranspiration. And that which they don't hold, which reaches the ground, if the native plant garden has had time to establish, it'll do a much better job of absorbing that stormwater. And this, I come back to my question, who needs restoration? Why do we care about this ecosystem service? Well, this is a picture of my own street. That's my front yard. Humble, I know. I like gravel. Low maintenance. But that is actually not the highest that our street floods. And this is just a typical storm in May here in Manhattan, Kansas. The highest has been up to my porch steps, completely covering that whole front yard. Fortunately, our houses are built high and I don't ever have trouble with my home flooding, but this is a many times a year occurrence. What happens for people on the street is their cars are totaled. If they're new to the neighborhood and no one gave them the signal of park on the alley, don't park your car in the street if there's a storm. We frequently rush outside to move our car at 2 a.m. if we hear the thunder rolling. So yeah, who needs this? We all need this. I'm not highly familiar with the flood situation in Douglas County, but it's a critical one here in Riley County. And I know it's a critical one in the Kansas City Metro and the Wichita Metro. We have got to do a better job of recognizing we have to think like water. It's not rocket science ultimately, although the engineers might want you to believe it is. But if we would just absorb the simple idea that impervious surfaces shed water and that water flows downhill, we'd start to understand a lot of the problems we've created with development and overdevelopment and the destruction of those natural landscapes such as grasslands. So the meadow actually received a recent award related to some of those ecological benefits that it provides. And I'll show you just a little bit more about that. But we designed the planting there to work with some varied conditions on the site because the site came with some beautiful mature trees. And I think everything we've talked about so far, you can understand our desire to keep them because shade, right? Compatibility. It's a key value for humans. That restorative, wonderful quality of being under a tree canopy. So even though many of the trees on site are not native, and our goal here was to demonstrate plants native to the Flint Hills, we still kept all those mature, wonderful trees with the exception of a couple of overgrown and really declining hackberries. And those became our benches here at the meadow. So you can see this is not our original planning list, by the way, but this is what was evident after vegetation survey at about 4 years into the project. So we actually seeded more like 55 species. And of those, we've been able to verify about 34 that have taken off there. This was the site before our intervention. So it was a kind of a typical unirrigated turf grass patch at K-State. You can see that the turf is not the healthiest or the happiest. And then you can see the many trees that were on the site. So I've already talked about this. I'll skip this slide. So we talked a little bit already about the benefits of native plants and that infiltration. Here's what our installation looked like. And the first thing we had to deal with was erosion control. Any good site project, we're first thinking about what will happen when we remove the existing vegetation, right? What will happen to our soil? And in this case, we took a very intentional approach to removing the existing turf grass. I was about to say normally, typical practices, and even practices I've used in the past in my career, involve using herbicide, synthetic herbicide, Roundup, etc., to basically kill off the turf grass. Generally, that's done with multiple applications at different seasons to try and catch the turf grasses in various stages of growth and kill them. And then a very common way to install a landscape like this would be to drill the prairie seed through the dead thatch of turf grass. Well, we made a choice on this project to use as little synthetic herbicide as we could, because there are growing amounts of evidence that we should be quite concerned about even those that we were told were safe, like Roundup. So we only used herbicide on about 10% of the site underneath the trees in their root zones where we didn't want to compact the soil. The rest of the site, we stripped it. It was manually stripped of the sod. And then at that point, of course, the soil was very vulnerable. So what you're seeing in this picture is one of my favorite parts of the project. No one can see it anymore, right? It's long gone. But we had Boy Scouts who volunteered to make our soil erosion control measure. They saved us about $1,500 on a very tight budget. This was a $7,000 budget for this project. So really almost nothing for a 3/4 acre site. And what they did is save us considerable money. And they also came up with a really innovative biodegradable way to do this. So they got reused, repurposed t-shirts, things from thrift stores, and they sewed them into these tubes. And then they filled the tubes with mulch. And the pictures of these Boy Scouts with their sewing machines was awesome. I have to tell you, it's so great to see young Boy Scouts learning needlecraft. Was cool. And they came and installed them with the stakes. They pounded these stakes. I mean, these guys were strong little scouts. There's a couple of them in the background actually moving hay. You can see that. This turned out to be a better solution than we even imagined. Not only did it hold the soil in place, it worked, to prevent the erosion downhill, but it beautifully biodegraded within the first year. So I had anticipated having to go in and deinstall these and haul them away in a pickup truck. Nope, didn't need to, because the t-shirts and the mulch had just completely degraded. It was wonderful. So the other aspect I should point out here of installation, because I know there's some of you interested in these kind of landscapes. What we did after that stripping of sod is we scarified with hard rakes. We did not have any kind of a seed drill. So we simply scarified and did what they call a broadcast seeding method. We used the wood sawdust from our hackberries that had to come off. That wood sawdust was used as what we call a bulking medium for the seeds, which helps in spreading. It helps you to get an even distribution rate. So our sawdust and our seed mixtures, different mixtures for different light conditions. And these volunteers all in one day scarified and broadcast the seed. And then we covered that with a thin layer of prairie straw just to help keep moisture in. There is no irrigation, as I mentioned, on the site. There, however, is a hose bib. So pretty much it was me that whole first summer dragging hoses around this site, and boy, did I get tired of it. But it paid off, because 1 year in, we didn't need to do any more watering. These are those hackberries that we took out and decided to reuse as much as we could, every bit of what was there. This was very early in the project. Boy, does it look sad. And this was the phase of the project where I think people wondered what's going on there. Like, it kind of looks like they're doing something, but are those just weeds? You know, what's going to happen here? And we had a few tricks up our sleeve. You know, we have to remind people we're not done yet. That's a phrase that one of my volunteers on the Northview Learning Garden taught me. We're not done yet. It takes a constant effort to get to done with a landscape like this, and it involves a lot of weeding early on. We take every volunteer that comes our way, regardless of age. We will use them to help us weed in this landscape. As it became established, much less now, much less weeding required. But also some of those tricks up our sleeves. And if I always say this, I have to credit this quote. I have a great friend who's a naturalist in the Kansas City area, and some of you may know her. Her name is Catherine Bilanowski. She works for University of Missouri Extension now. She's a horticulturalist. And she taught me about this wonderful annual plant, this beautiful plains or prairie coreopsis, which is an annual, and it will reseed, but you can also certainly enhance it with more seed. And I call it the bacon of plants because people love it. And so in our first couple of years of the meadow, when it could have been just like complaint city, you know, I could have had a public relations kind of nightmare on my hands. In fact, I didn't, because people love these big, airy blossoms of the plains coreopsis. So probably it's due to Catherine Bilanowski that this project survived and her idea. And then, of course, as the landscape grew in and became more established, I think aesthetically also people could see the benefits of this landscape. Learn from the process. I always will say that, and I know I'm deviating a little bit from the ecological focus, but you'll see why I'm saying that. Not just in planning your project, but learn from the process and what you've actually done. This is my colleagues and I doing a vegetation survey on the site several years in. This is how we determined what really worked and what really didn't work. We used a transect method, and then what's called a Daubenmeier frame. This is a way of getting a true kind of sample that's not biased. And we recorded with photographs and also with our clipboards. We did as much as we could in the field, and then when we couldn't identify something, we would look it up from the photo and figure out exactly what was there. We also did a study of the pollinators in the meadow. We wanted to know, you know, here we say this is a great pollinator garden, and in fact it's a monarch way station, also this garden. We say it has these qualities, but does it really, right? What pollinators are frequenting, or as I learned entomologists call it, what potential pollinators are frequenting, because unless we see them pollinating, they're not pollinators. So we did this study with pan traps, and we also did what they call a visual observation study. And we found indeed that there were about 8 different families of pollinators using the site. Any of you who are into entomology, you know that identification of insects is incredibly challenging. I think I might have another photo of us in doing our pollinator work. Here we are gathering our pan traps. I didn't include the pictures of us in the lab with microscopes, but I got to learn a little bit about bee and wasp identification. And we felt very good to be able to get it to the family level. Apparently species level identification of these pollinators can be very hard. I'm not talking about the monarch there on the left, but different kinds of bees and wasps can be very challenging to identify. So indeed, we found that it was successful in its goal. And our next step there, this is part of learning from the process, our next step was to interpret and reveal to the public what's going on here. So we created a series of signs. We had them printed by a company called Lark Label out of Wichita. They did a wonderful job. They produced these durable aluminum, dark surfaces with pale graphics and lettering. And we wanted to interpret the stormwater benefits there, as well as other kinds of benefits happening on the site. So you can see we were talking about water savings, chemical-free, what are the benefits there, and also the fact that volunteers are helping to maintain this. So I'm going to conclude with this slide just to let you know that if you're interested in the thoughts in this lecture or landscape architecture, I would welcome more dialogue with you. My email address is there. It's very easy to remember. It's just my initials, KKP@KSU. And of course, if landscape architecture interests you specifically, I encourage you to check out asla.org. If you know someone, or maybe you yourself are interested in a graduate or undergraduate degree, please feel free to refer them to our Director of Recruitment, Karina Talfi at K-State. And I do have a list of references. Before I send this slideshow to you all, which I'd be happy to send to Chris or Sharon, I will add a couple more references in here that I used in today's lecture. And with that, I am prepared to answer any other questions that you might have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I am going to scroll up in my chat box here to get to where we left off. And in the last question and answer session, you did mention there was a question here about a winter landscape, and you addressed that in terms of the form of plants. But another feature of a landscape that is brought up is water. And how important is water in the landscape?
And I think the person probably means water features, or water that a human can interact with. Is that right?
It's unspecified in the
Okay.
comment.
Yes.
Yes? Okay, great. I think it is incredibly valuable, and I might ask some of you to chime in here. But if we think about those qualities of attention restorative landscapes, if we think about the landscape providing fascination, water is something which humans find endless fascination with. And I know this myself, and from observing others. An example that I like to use with my students is the Lady Diana Memorial in Hyde Park in London. I don't know if any of you have been there or maybe seen images of it, but it's essentially an ellipse, a large ellipse that's a water trough. And because of the way it's designed, the water runs over different surfaces, and it glitters and it shimmers. It is such an attractor to people that the flaws of the surrounding site design become really evident, because it's basically muddy ground around this whole thing because people just want to be there. And I visited, I think it was the summer of 2013, I visited that landscape. Europeans have a little different attitude than us, but children were stripping down naked and just jumping in the fountain. People were playing all over it. You could see where the grounds maintenance folks were trying to reseed areas of grass, and they would have that like construction fencing, you know, stay off. And they're trying to reestablish the grass. And I just kept thinking, good luck with that, because people are just going to keep wanting to be right next to that water, right? That's why I'll sometimes use it as an example with students in site design, because they need to think about compatibility. So ground plane surface in that instance was not very compatible to people's needs to get close to the water, right? So water is going to give that endless source of fascination to people. And in that way, if it's something that can be done in an ecologically sound way, and if the project can afford it, water features can be expensive. If the project can afford it, I'd say absolutely, why not? Judy, do you mind if I pick on you here? Judy Birch, are you still here with us?
I don't mind.
Okay, good. Judy studied gardens for communities of aging, and in fact designed a garden for dementia care community in Heston, Kansas as part of her graduate work. And there was a water feature involved in that design. Judy, do you want to comment at all on what you see as the benefits of a water feature?
Well, I think it plays right into it's automatic, like you said, it's automatic fascination. It just is, and it really contributes also to the idea of being away. But when I was studying at the Chicago Botanic Garden that week with the experts in that field, we actually did a little mini research project and went around and looked at various water features on their campus. And you would be surprised at how many water features are not restorative. And this focused primarily on the sounds that the water features would make. And some of them were kind of intimidating and scary. And so it's not sufficient just to have a water feature. It has to be designed so that it is restorative and makes you relax.
That's a great point. You know, the water feature when my street floods is not restorative to me. I don't find that water restorative, right? Absolutely. So context and the qualities of that water. Thank you, Judy. I knew you'd have some good thoughts on that. I hope we answered the question.
Yeah, lots of great things to think about. And another question here is on the, if you could comment on the potential of alleys as restorative landscapes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, in urban design and neighborhood planning, there's really some great literature out there about alleys and their significance to people. And part of the idea of alleys in our neighborhood cohesion is that alleys are the informal places where we might happen to run up against our neighbors and say hello, just in the course of our everyday comings and goings. Because we use alleys, you know, often for like trash storage and parking our cars. So they have a really important neighborhood function. And the idea that you could make them more than just utilitarian, I think is a really fantastic idea, especially in an urban setting where space is precious. In my own neighborhood here in Manhattan, there's a push to concretize all of our alleys. We have gravel alleys right now. I've spoken against it a couple of times because I think it's just going to exacerbate our stormwater issues in the neighborhood. The plan is to put in concrete with no further stormwater infrastructure, unfortunately. So it will only create more runoff. And the opposite would be true if a homeowner decided to use a portion of their property letting the alley right of way. Of course, they couldn't put this in the right of way, but if they chose to use part of their property to do something green, that would actually encourage stormwater infiltration and pollinator use and be a beautiful amenity for the neighborhood. That's a fantastic idea. All the benefits we've talked about could absolutely be there. Most definitely. I think also this gets toward the idea of, or the concept of cues of care, which is a famous concept in landscape architecture from the researcher Joan Nassauer at University of Michigan. She wondered what her particular question was, what makes people accept wild, messy looking landscapes like the meadow, right? What makes them accept that rather than manicured landscapes? And what she found was that cues of care were very, very important. And some of those cues were how the edge was treated. Was it an orderly edge? Were there other things that seemed intentional? So at the meadow, our benches and the way we have treated the path and other things are a big cue of care. Although you can sure see weeds in this photo, and I still regret it to this day. But in an alley setting, you can imagine that having some patches that are landscape, which are maintained by the homeowner in theory, or maybe it's a whole block or however they're handling that, that is another cue to care for the setting, that this place matters. This is not a place where risky or dangerous things happen. It's a place that we care about, right? So I think that's a fantastic idea to consider alleys. Is there a master gardener right now thinking about an alley project in Douglas County?
There might be now.
Anybody chiming in with that? I don't know of anybody thinking about alley projects, but it might be something to think about in the future. That was a very interesting question. And I encourage people to go over into the chat box and look at the comments there. There's been some wonderful comments in addition to both what Katie and Judy have said. There's one big giant question about how homeowners can begin to build these transformative landscapes. But before we get to that in terms of what homeowners can do with this information, does anybody want to chime in verbally and ask a question?
Thank you for prompting that. Before we do, this might give another second for someone to formulate their verbal question. I was able to just peek quickly at the chat, and I saw a comment in there about the lasagna method, which I think someone's referring to sheet composting. And I just want to say yes, 100% yes. On small sites in particular, this is a wonderful, eco-friendly, non-herbicide way to get rid of that turf grass you might be dealing with and do something different. It's actually what I use in my own home landscape. I am done digging up turf grass. My knees are done, and therefore I am done. So the sheet composting method is just fantastic for so many reasons. Glad to see that in your chat. Okay, verbal questions.
I have a question. This is May Christensen with the Johnson County Extension Master Gardener. In I see a lot of that lasagna method, but what follow up to that method is what I'm interested to know. Like, how long do you wait? What do you do? When to do it, etc. Can you elaborate with your experience?
Sure, I sure will. Thank you. Glad to have a Johnson County Master Gardener here too. So there's a lot of different ways you can follow up to that sheet composting preparation. I've done two different things predominantly. The first might be the simplest, where I've put down my large sheets of cardboard. I use cardboard, big, boxes. Like if you can go to a Best Buy and get refrigerator boxes, etc., that's really good. Putting those down, weighting them with rocks or bricks or whatnot, going through the entire fall and winter season. And then into your next season, you really have effectively killed whatever was there. You can peel back that layer if you want. So this is the most simple way to do this. You can peel back that sheet and plant whatever you like. Depending on whatever you like depends on whether you prepare the soil or disturb the soil, right? And then in a more complex, longer term way, I've also used sheet composting method combined with kind of a hugelkultur approach. So I had a hugel in my front yard for about 3 years. I'm sure the neighbors were like not happy with the crazy looking pile of sticks and leaves and things. But I began with the cardboard layers. I added lots of old compost and leaves. I then put another layer of cardboard. Then I had large limbs really that had fallen out of our trees and more compost. I grew vegetables in that for a couple of years as a hugel approach. And then I got tired of how it looked, quite honestly. And so I just I basically put all of the contents in a wheelbarrow, took it to my backyard, to my garden bed to compost it further. And I turned that hugelkultur area into a shrub bed. And these are the happiest shrubs I have ever planted because they're basically going into soft, deep compost that had been maturing for several years. So I know that's not like a one size fits all answer, but I think depending on what your goal is of the sheet or lasagna method, you can do a lot of different things. And to me, the key benefit is we're not using herbicide to start our next step with the landscape. I know that some of the things people like about herbicide is they feel it's a quick answer, and a sheet compost is not a quick answer. It's going to be a multi-season kind of an effort. But you know what? It can still look aesthetic, depending on how you feel. And I am a minimalist, so I appreciate tan sheets of cardboard across my yard with artfully arranged rocks. But it doesn't have to be an ugly thing as you're waiting for your sheet method to work. I hope that helps answer the question. Are some of you here using those type of methods in gardening you're doing? Yes, Judy raised her hand. Awesome, great. Great. I mean, it's just, to me, I'm finding there's a less labor involved, and anytime I can have less labor, well, thank heavens. I mean, it's like when we're first learning to garden and we discover mulch, and we're like, wow, this is amazing. So anything we can do that's less laborious and cuts down on our use of chemical herbicides, I think is a good thing. Any other questions out there?
Anybody want to chime in with a question? No?
I probably,
Okay.
Sharon, I should just say as a follow-up to that last question, and as a kind of a acknowledgement of the expertise that all of you have, I'm not a horticulturalist. I greatly respect what horticulturalists do, and I work closely with horticulturalists because of their knowledge. So I will not be a great person for the most technical questions, so maybe about how to with your landscape. But I know there are wonderful horticulturalists that work with every Master Gardener's program. And then the knowledge and the resources that each of you has as a Master Gardener develops that same level of horticultural expertise. So it's truly a fantastic thing to contribute to the communities that you work with, is the horticultural knowledge that you gather through the program.
Yes, please ask your local extension office to talk with the Master Gardeners, and they're always willing to help. And I'm going to wrap these last two questions in. One just popped up again based on your last comment. So previously in the chat box, somebody had asked about how homeowners can get started on these types of landscapes. But in addition to that, a comment has come up that sometimes it's a struggle to do that because of homeowner association restrictions and city codes regarding natural landscapes. I'm wondering if you can address those two things to sort of wrap up this session.
Absolutely. Wonderful questions. So first, I would recommend a book to anyone who would like to try making a meadow-like or native plants landscape. The best resource I've found that I think is very easy to follow and easy to use is called Creating Urban and Suburban Meadows. It's by Catherine Zimmerman. She's the author, Catherine Zimmerman. And in her book, she actually details a whole lot of different potential methods, because depending on your site and your wishes for the final outcome, there are people who simply let their lawn grow up and selectively overplant native species. That's a harder sell in those restrictive neighborhood covenants that were just mentioned. But she also goes through some how-to in terms of using sheet methods to create a small native landscape. So that's a fantastic resource in book. I do not feel that you have to think of it as labor intensive, although the part that most people underestimate is the weeding needed in the first couple of years of installation and then ongoing. But in the first couple of years, most sources, and Catherine Zimmerman is the same, will recommend that you mow your landscape to about 6 inches height. And what that's doing is preventing the annual weeds from flowering and reseeding themselves. Whereas the native plants you're trying to establish, they're really doing most of their work underground, putting down their deep roots, and it doesn't disturb those perennials not to get a chance to flower and put out seed. So her book would just be a great foundational resource if you're thinking of doing that. Creating Urban and Suburban Meadows is the name of the book. And then the question about covenants and ordinance, it's a big one. It's certainly a big question. There probably are still communities in which the grass height ordinance, which as we all know was probably created with the best of intentions, where people did not want, just weedy lots of trash in their neighborhood. Those grass height ordinances, sometimes they are over 6 inches, sometimes it's over a foot, where a person can be fined. I know there are communities that have those ordinances, and the way that homeowners who want to have native or natural landscaping, the way they deal with that is by making the point that it's a perennial garden, is what it is. It's a perennial garden. It's not an unmown grass landscape. I've heard stories I think it was in Lenexa, where there was a very restrictive ordinance about natural landscapes or unmown kinds of landscapes. And one homeowner who had developed a natural front yard, what they did is they went out with temporary spray paint and they circled every weed in their neighbor's turf grass. I'm assuming with their neighbor's permission, or that might not have gone over well, but they circled every weed, and then they circled the few weeds that were existing in their prairie patch that they were developing. And they showed how there were actually many more weeds in that turf grass landscape, and it was accepted within their particular context at that point. So I would just say reinforcing the fact that it's a perennial garden is very important. And if you're in a restrictive covenant area, you might find out what would it take for this to be acceptable. If a perennial garden bed is acceptable in your community restrictions, then a perennial garden bed of native plants should be acceptable. It could be by using some of those tricks of cues to care that you really make it palatable. So a very well-maintained turf edge to your wild, messy landscape might be important, or gravel or rocks or something like that, if you're worried about aesthetic acceptance. But the key here is it's a perennial garden, right? And if you're in a neighborhood that accepts other perennial gardens, they can't just discriminate against yours because they're native plants, right? That doesn't make sense. So that's usually a logic that will work. I hope that answers the question.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm just going to mention a resource here that's brand new, and then I'll turn it over to Chris to talk about what's happening next month on our education program. But just out, I've put it in the chat box. If you Google Plant Native Kansas, there's a new series of publications put out by Douglas County Extension, the Grassland Heritage Foundation, and the Kansas Rural Center, specifically for how to garden with natives, how to landscape with natives, prairie reconstruction, prairie restoration, native cropland borders. It's a series of brochures and pamphlets and publications for essentially how to plant natives specifically for this region of the country. So I urge you to check that out. It's in the link is in the chat box there. It's just Google Plant Native Kansas, and you should be able to get to that. And then I'll just turn it over to say thank you very much. Lots and lots of positive comments in the chat box. Thank you very much for presenting this. And I'll turn it over to Chris to talk about, to close us out and talk about next month.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you all. Great to be here with you.
Thanks, Katie. It was wonderful. Next month, we have Jerry Jost. He's from the Kansas Land Trust, and he'll be talking in part about conservation easements. So another way to help with having native plants and keeping land and not concrete. So with that, we're over and out. Thanks again.
Chris, thanks so much for inviting me. And Cynthia, thank you so much for inviting me. This was really fantastic to be with you. So have a great rest of your Saturday.
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Bye.